Then I would like to ask Charlie to come on the stage.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ron. Well, welcome everyone. It's my wife and I are delighted to be here at Speedy Tuesday. It's our first event with Speedy Tuesday, and look forward to many more. And I want to thank Omega for sponsoring me and letting me be a part of this family. It's a great opportunity for me and my wife Dorothy to get to travel all over the world. Representing a company that I've been wearing their watches for a long, long time. My first one was, of course, one NASA gave me back in I was on a crew about 1969. Then I had a training watch, and then I had a flight watch that I wore, and when I got back, I kept it. Which NASA let me do for about 4 or 5 years, and then they said, we want that back, and so turned it back in, and now that watch is in a museum in South Carolina where I grew up. I was South Carolina's first astronaut, and so they have a space exhibit, and so that's watches on display, but I got another couple of Omegas, and so I'm delighted to just to be a part of the Omega family. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Some people have asked me, this your first time to Germany? No, it's not. My first time to Germany was 1959 when I came over as a fighter pilot. A lieutenant in the Air Force stationed at Ramstein. Spent 3 years here as a fighter pilot, and during that time, in 1961, I was here from 59 to 62, May of 62, and I went back to MIT to get a master's degree. But during that time I was here, we had first off, Yuri Gagarin was launched into space. Then Alan Shepard was launched into space in May of 61. About 3 weeks later, President Kennedy announced we're going to go to the moon, we're going to land on the moon, and we're going to come back safely. The astronauts like the come back safely part. And nobody wanted a one-way trip. So I was incredulous, really. The whole squadron just hoo-hawed, we laughed. You know, we had 15 minutes in space, and he's committing us to go to the moon in the next 8.5 years. And I didn't, it's not possible. I wasn't qualified to be an astronaut back in those days, so I didn't even dream about that. But when I got back to MIT, I was working actually on the Apollo guidance and navigation system. And I met some of the astronauts, like the second group and the third group of astronauts, and they were so excited about this job that they had. And so I got the fire, and I said, well, how did I get that job? And he said, well, you got to go to test pilot school. So Dorothy and I met my first summer at MIT. She's from Atlanta, Georgia, but was up working in Boston, and we met and fell in love and got married June of 63. And then after I graduated the next year, off we went to Edwards Air Force Base to test pilot school. I worked for a very famous American test pilot, Chuck Yeager, first man to fly faster than the speed of sound. And he was the commandant of test pilot school. And when I graduated in 65, I went on his staff. But the next month, NASA this was like September 1965, they said, we need more astronauts, please apply. And so I looked at the qualifications, they said, hey, that's me. And so I applied, and because I knew it was the best job you could have as a test pilot. So I got to NASA in April of 66. and we started our training. And by the summer of '68, we had a very big setback. At 1967 in January, the fire killed three astronauts. Then we had 4 killed in airplane accidents about that time, and 1 killed in an automobile accident. So the 54 that were picked, there were only now 42 of us left. John Glenn had retired, Scott Carpenter, some of the original 7. So there were about 42, maybe 44 of us that were qualified for space flight. And so we all started working very hard. My first job was support crew for Apollo 10, and I helped develop the procedures for the checkout and activation of the lunar module in orbit. And so Apollo 10 was the first time we took the lunar module to the moon. The second time we had humans at the moon, first was Apollo 8 on Christmas of 1968, which, by the way, to me was the riskiest mission NASA ever undertook. Because we launched those guys, and once they left Earth orbit, it had to work. If it didn't work, they'd never get back. So it was a second mission with Apollo, and very risky, but they pulled it off, and NASA pulled it off, and it was very successful. And now Apollo 10 was checking out the lunar module, and I'm in mission control doing that, doing the Capcom role, talking to the crew as they were orbiting the moon and simulating a descent and landing on the moon and then aborting. Well, it was so successful that our team of flight controller just rolled over to Apollo 11, and so I'm in now a Capcom for Apollo 11, and the mission controller shift work. So you had, I think we had 3 or 4 shifts, and so you're on for 8 hours, 12 hours, then you're off, and you came back on again. Well, our big shift was the landing. And so we had trained with the crew during the landing, went through a lot of problems and training, but we felt like we were ready to go. And so we started our descent. And as we did, we started having problems. First, communication problems. There was a mission rule that if you didn't have data from the spacecraft for 30 seconds, you were getting close to an abort. And so the data started dropping out. We had to reorient spacecraft. That was the first of the problems. Then we had computer overload problems. And when I saw that at my console, I thought we were aboard. You can't land without a computer. But the flight controller, Steve Bales, and a guy in the back room named Jack Gorman, they had studied these alarms, and so we're go on that alarm. So I shouted up to from mission control, Eagle, you're go, and so we continued. And those alarms kept repeating as we came on down, and then at about 7,000 feet, 22,000 meters, they saw the moon for the first time, and it was not where they expected to be. So he couldn't land there, so he had to level off and fly over several kilometers till he found a level spot. Now we're in mission control. You had no visual, but you were listening to them. And it was very tense because all of these problems were compounding. So it got very, very tense in mission control. And then that trajectory problem caused fuel problems. So now we're getting minimum fuel. So the last 2 calls they were here in mission control, from mission control, was Eagle 60 seconds. He had 60 seconds to land. Then the next call was Eagle 30 seconds. And the call after that was supposed to be abort. So we started on down, and I called Eagle 60 seconds. Then I called Eagle 30 seconds. and you could hear Buzz Aldrin said 30 feet, 20 feet, down 6, whatever it was, and lateral velocity 0, those kind of calls. And so I started my stopwatch and counted down, and 13 seconds later I heard contact, engine stop. And the tension was through the roof, as you can imagine. We had 17 seconds before we were going to call an abort. Now, if we'd have gotten to that end of that 30 seconds and I'd have called an abort, I am convinced that Neil Armstrong or Buzz would have said, "Say again, Houston, we don't understand you." They were going to land that spacecraft. 30 feet off the moon, you don't abort. Because when we call an abort, we actually had 4% fuel remaining. And that 4% was designed to get you positive rate of climb away from the moon and then abort, then a stage to the ascent stage. Well, they could use that to land, and so I'm sure that's what they would have done. But fortunately, we didn't have to get to that stage of abort. So there were only 4 of us, if I recall, 4 of us that knew that when he landed, Armstrong was going to change the call sign from Eagle to Tranquility Base, which was the area they landed on. And so he comes back, and the 4 of us was me and Mission Control and the 3 crew. And Neil has told me, "Now I'm going to do this, but don't tell anybody." And I said, "Okay, yes sir." And so he calls up Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. And I mean, it was so exciting. We were so excited in Mission Control that I couldn't even say Tranquility. It came out twang. But I corrected myself, and Roger, Tranquility, we copy on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue, we're breathing again. And we literally were. If you can imagine a great big balloon pumped full of air and somebody stick a pin in it and that, all the air escapes, that's the way the tension disappeared in Mission Control after we heard contact, engine stop. So it was a successful landing. We were there for about another hour. Then we changed shifts, so I was home with my kids and Dorothy to watch Neil Armstrong step onto the moon for the very first step. Then I got put on backup crew for Apollo 13. And if you've seen the movie that Tom Hanks did, it was a very good movie. So it realistically showed the problems and the hard work that it took to get them back safely after they had oxygen tank blow up. We had 2 in the command service module. We had 2 liquid oxygen tanks. One blew up, and when it did, a piece of the material, the shrapnel, went through the bulkhead, punctured the line of the other tank, and it all leaked out. So without oxygen, you don't breathe very long, and you certainly don't have any electrical power, because we used oxygen and hydrogen in the command module to generate our electrical power. So they were in deep trouble, 55 hours out. But Mission Control worked really hard. John Young, TK Mattingly, we were the backup crew. We helped to develop the procedures that we had to get them back safely. And to be honest, it was 20 hours from the time of the accident till they reached the moon and started back. And for that first 20 hours, I didn't think we were going to make it. You look at the use of oxygen, cooling water, electrical power, everything was running out 15 hours before we got back. But we were able to figure out conserve everything, and it turned out we had enough stuff. And by the time we started back from the moon, I changed my mind from we ain't going to make it to we going to make it. And if they don't make a mistake and we don't make a mistake in Mission Control, we going to have enough stuff to get back. And sure enough, we did. The crew did a great job. We had one burn. We had no computer. Normally use the computer to operate the autopilot to fire the engine and shut off the engine. Well, they didn't have that, so he had to manually line up on the horizon of the earth or something to that effect. And they started their stopwatch. And the one thing I loved about the Speedmaster, it has this great stopwatch feature. That was my job on Apollo 16, was to start the watch at the right time. And if the engine didn't shut down at the right time, I'd say manually shut down. And that was our backup to the computer. So they didn't have that, so that's what they used to make this burn and to get them back into the corridor, if you will. We had a 4-degree angle that we had to hit to get into re-entry. And if you were too shallow, you'd bounce out. If you're too steep, it would burn up on re-entry. And so it was very critical to get into that corridor, if you will. I remember on our flight, we were on the far side of the moon, what we call the backside, and we had a burn to change our orbit from 60 miles, and we were on a 60 mile by 170 miles on the front side. And we had to take 170 miles down to 8 miles, which was going to be our point of starting our descent. And a 1 second overburn would 8 miles would go to 0 and you'd crash. And so it was very, very important that you got that burn right. So when Mattingly started, I started my watch, and I knew how long it was supposed to be, and it was going to be, let's say, 28 seconds or what it was. When I got to 28 seconds, I said shut down, and about that time the computer shut it down. So then we had to be careful to make sure it was right, and so we did some sort of a maneuver to, when we saw Earthrise, if it came at this exact second, we knew we were okay. So there were a lot of critical maneuvers that we had, and on the lunar surface, of course, our Speedmaster was worn on a Velcro band on the outside of our spacesuit, and we helped to time every place that we were there, but with mission control being the primary. Okay, guys, you've been here 10 minutes, your time's up, get back in the car and go to the next spot. But we also had, in case we had a communication problems, we had our backup with our watches. So it was, we got very familiar with our Speedmasters, of course. Well, I got to fly on Apollo 16 and we were the 5th landing on the moon, April 1972. It was a great thrill flying with John Young and T.K. Mattingly. Ken Mattingly was his nickname at the time. Mattingly was supposed to be on Apollo 13, but I caught the measles and exposed him to the measles, so they took him off the flight, put in Jack Swigert, and so we ended up with Mattingly on our crew. There's a long story about the measles and Mattingly's response to the measles, but I won't go into that. So anyway, we got to Apollo 16, and it was my first and only time to get into space. But if you're only going to go once, landing on the moon was the best flight you could have. And so we got on board the Saturn V, and we were strapped in, and everybody, what did you feel like? Well, your emotions were, let's go. I'm ready, let's go. Keep counting. We trained for 2 years for this moment. And I didn't want to hear T-minus 10 minutes. Well, we got this leak, abort. and so we'd have to climb back out. And you only had 4 hours to get off. If you didn't get off in that 4 hours, you had to wait another month. Well, in that month, you could have an accident, you could break your leg, you could get killed in an airplane accident, they could cancel the mission, a lot of things could happen and you wouldn't have your chance. So everybody in that spacecraft was keep counting, I'm ready to go, keep counting, I'm ready to go. And sure enough, they kept counting, and at T0, T-minus 8 seconds, they started the engines, and at T0, if everything worked right, launch control said commit. They released it, and you were on your way. The Saturn had thrust 5 engines that produced 3.5 million kilos of thrust, and so you had 3.5 pushing 3. So it was very slow at first. You couldn't hear any noise though. Now, the visitors that were watching, they had a lot of noise, as Dorothy could tell you. And you had this pulsating air beating you in the chest, but we didn't feel any of that, but we had a vibration. The vibration was from side to side. And it really shook. Each vehicle had its own characteristic, if you will. The alignment of the engines, the structure, big aluminum structure. You're up on the top, 110 meters from the engines at the bottom. And so if it shook from side to side, you can imagine as it shook down here a little bit, by the time it got up to the top, it was a real vibration. And that was the only thing I remember from liftoff, was the slow acceleration and the vibration. The noise, we had our helmets on and communication hats, and so the noise I remember is us breathing and the oxygen flow and the communication, us talking back and forth to mission control. But the vibration lasted for 2 minutes. First stage was 2 minutes and 40 seconds for us. And it took us, I think, to about 35 miles, 50 kilometers or so, and several, probably 12,000 kilometers per hour velocity. And in that 2 minutes and 40 seconds, those engines had consumed 2 million kilos of fuel. Well over half the weight of the vehicle was gone after the first 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Then they shut down, and from then on in the orbit was really smooth. We circled the Earth 1.5 times. We left Earth orbit over Australia, and when we shut down, we were on our way. And hello Houston, hello Houston. They weren't answering. Hello Houston, no. Finally this Aussie voice saying, Roger, we copy you. This is Goldstone, not Goldstone, but Honeysuckle, and what can we do for you? So we said, well, transmit this to mission control, and this is our residual burns. And so the burn was great. We're on our way, and so we had a few other comments. And then he said, Roger, we'll transmit to Houston. We'll have the link back up real quickly. Anything else I can do for you? John said, we'd like a case of Swan beer, please. So, well, I can't quite get it to you. But, you know, when we got back 12 days later, each of us had a case of Swan beer and delivered to our house. So those friends that are still alive from Honeysuckle and were very, very, turned out to be very, very good friends, and so we ended up still friends today. It was a team effort to get to the moon. You were 3 of us up on the top of that rocket, but there was 400,000 people in that pyramid that were pushing us to get us there. Apollo was, to me, one of the greatest team efforts that I'd ever participated in. And I was very proud to have represented NASA and the U.S. on our mission. John and I landed on a place called Descartes, which was southwest of where Neil Armstrong had landed in the Sea of Tranquility. From his landing spot to our landing spot was about 2,500 meters difference in elevation. So we were up in the mountains of the moon, and was the only mission that was ever sent to what we call the Lunar Highlands. So it was very important geologically, and we had trained to find volcanic rocks up there, because that's what they all were in the Mare. But we got there and there were no volcanic rocks. There were some fragments of volcanic rocks that had been blasted out of the Mare in our area, but none that were really, you'd say, just a piece of basalt or something like that. So it was very unique in the geology of our landing spot, and they were very excited. First off, I think that we started describing these rocks, and well, that's not what they're supposed to be finding. We've wasted 6 years of geology on these guys, and so they were a little upset. But the more positive we became about these descriptions, they got very excited, because it was some unique rocks that would never been collected on the other missions. John and I had a great time on the moon. It was 71 hours. And we were so excited and having so much fun, we didn't want to come back. We were ready. We were arguing for another 2 hours, but they said since we were 6 hours late landing, we consumed a lot of power, and so they were getting concerned about power supplies, and so they made us lift off. They wouldn't give us 2 more hours. And I felt right at home on the moon. It was a beautiful place. Buzz Aldrin called it magnificent desolation, and that's exactly what it was. It was the most beautiful desert I'd ever seen, untouched and spoiled. So you had wonder. It was just a wonder. I'm on the moon, and excitement and enthusiasm and just all these emotions that you can imagine you're having. I'm on the moon, and that kept hitting me. Nobody's ever been here before. John and I are on this spot, and we had this car we drove called the Lunar Rover. He drove it and I navigated. Everybody asked, what was it like driving on the moon? I said, well, I can't tell you. He wouldn't let me drive it. That was his job, and I was to navigate. Actually, I had the better job, because he had the photographs that we had of our landing area had a resolution of 15 meters. So everything less than 15 meters you couldn't see in these photographs. But there were a lot of 15 meter, less than 15 meter holes, rocks up in our landing area. So as we pitched over at about 2,000 meters, we looked out and, God, where did all that come from, you know? And so we had to maneuver around to pick a spot to land. And so there was a lot of things that we were seeing for the very first time. And so that led to the excitement of it. You could see the major landmarks, like to the south was Stone Mountain, to the not Rocky, but the Smoky Mountains on the right. And a lot of these big craters, even from the surface, you could see where they were out there. So I navigated, John drove, and we had a directional gyro, and we had an odometer to give us direction and distance. And so the maps were such that, well, stop A, go 220 for 1.5 kilometers, turn left, whatever it said. And I had to get us from point A to point B. And John had to drive, because driving, you come over a ridge, and that might be a big crater in front of you, or a rock. So he'd have to maneuver around real quickly. We set the moon speed record, later equal by Apollo 17. And the nearest I can tell, it was greater than 17 kilometers per hour, because that's as high as the speedometer went. You hit 17, it wouldn't go any, you're going faster than that, but you couldn't tell how fast. It was greater than 17. We also set the high jump record on the moon, which was the most terrifying. It was the only terrifying moment of my experience on the moon. With all of my equipment on, down here I weighed 165 kilograms. And up on the moon, 27 kilograms. So you could bounce a lot. And so we were going to do the Moon Olympics at the end of our stay. And so we started bouncing. And so when I jumped up and straightened up. Well, the center of gravity went backwards, and over I went backwards like that. And it was the only time I was afraid, because if I hit on that backpack wrong and it breaks, I'm dead like that, because it had all your life support system back there. And so I rolled right, broke my fall, bounced onto my back, and John came over and looked down, I can remember, and said, "That wasn't very smart, Charlie." Yeah, help me up, John. So he pulled me up, and my heart was pounding, but I could tell the pressure gauge read normal. We had a remote control unit that you could tell everything looked normal. I could hear the oxygen flow, and so I began to calm down. Then I looked up, and the TV camera was pointed right at me, and Mission Control was very upset. Dorothy was in Mission Control, and at the time back in the viewing area, and she can tell you exactly the response from Mission Control. I imagine it was a few choice comments, but they were very calm, but they just said, "No more Moon Olympics," or whatever it was, "Get back inside." So we parked the car, left it up there. So if you want an $8 million car with a dead battery, there are 3 of them up on the moon. So go have at it. It was a tremendous experience. We got back, and it was so exciting that John and I volunteered to be backup crew for Apollo 17. They had a backup crew, but they got removed, and so we took their place, hoping that they would break their legs so that we could get to go again. But they stayed healthy. So Apollo 17 was the end of Apollo. They canceled the last 3 missions, which was a big disappointment for the astronaut office. Let's see, about time's up. But we'll have a chance for Q&A later on for everybody. It was a great experience for me, and I look back on it now as, of course, my flying career was by far the greatest experience you could have. And so I was very fortunate to be the 10th man on the moon, and I was the youngest, and now 47 years later, I'm still the youngest. To your questions, and have a chance to socialize a little bit. Thanks so much to Omega for inviting me here, and for your Speedy Tuesday. It's really nice. Thank you so much.